How's everybody doing this morning? You guys make it to Old Town last night, or should do a survey and see who stayed out the latest? All right, there we go. So two priests, a Dominican and a Jesuit, were having a conversation. They were trying to decide if it's a sin to smoke and pray at the same time. And they couldn't agree, so they went off to their respective superiors to ask them. A week later, they got back together. The Dominican says, "So what did you find out?" The Jesuit says, "Well, my superior said it's okay to," and the Dominican says, "Well, that's funny. Mine said it wasn't okay." The Jesuit said, "Well, what did you ask your superior?" He said, "Well, I asked him if it's okay to smoke while I pray." "What do you ask?" The Jesuit says, "Well, I asked him if it's okay to pray while I smoke." So the point there is that small changes in wording have big differences in our responses. And so that's essentially what we're talking about with survey methodology. And so NAHMS, National Studies, essentially tries to, or are based on the discipline of survey methodology. So a survey is a systematic method of gathering information from some study population, which is selected from a larger target population. And the whole purpose is to construct statistics or descriptors of that population. So that's kind of what survey methodology is about. And so we want to look at a few of those things. So here's this, got a couple pictures. Here's a picture of, we start with external population. In this case, it'd be all goat producers in the U.S. And then we use some kind of selection to get down to a more manageable study. So do you know what the number is for the number of goat producers in the U.S. total? More than we can visit, more than y'all can visit in this next year. So we use some kind of selection criteria to whittle that down to a target population. So in this case, it's the 25 states, and with goat producers, I have 5 or more goats. So that's our selection criteria, and that gives us our target population. And then we take all those producers and we put their names in that proverbial hat, and we select them out, and we get our study population. So we use sampling design to get down to our study population. So that's the selection process, and then we're going to do the interview and gather information on different attributes of their operation, and then we'll apply statistical weights to those responses to get back up to the target population and describe what's going on with that target population. And then if we're comfortable enough, we can actually generalize back to the external population. So how would you measure how well that goes? And in most epi studies, at least that are probability based, follow this process. So how would you describe and determine whether or not that was done well? Any thoughts? Or pardon?
What you want to find out?
Yeah. So, well, one of the ways we measure that, usually the only way, is looking at the confidence interval or standard errors. But there's actually a whole series of other errors that can come in. So this is just another way to depict that previous slide, focusing on the target population, the study population. So we start with our target population, and again, we have a sampling frame from which we'll draw our study population. We'll have our designated sample, then we go out and do the interviews, and then we'll present our results. So there's lots of places where error can occur in that process. So for one, we can have coverage error. So how good is our frame? Do we have duplicates on there? Do we have undercoverage? That's really NASA's bailiwick, so we don't have to worry about that too much. And those their frame actually has improved over the years for various reasons. So then there's the sampling error that can occur when we take that sampling frame and get our designated sample. And again, that's often pretty much what we measure. That's the confidence interval that we construct around our statistical estimates. But that's only one source of the error. We also have non-response error. We'll talk about that really briefly. That's on you as the interviewers to try to improve that, and it reflects how well we can sell the program to the selected sample. But then we also have errors in measurement. So there's errors in the representation, or they call those sampling errors. And again, typically that's all we focus on as far as measuring the quality of the study. But in reality, it's the non-sampling errors that really impact the quality of a study. And unfortunately, those aren't measured very often. Now, it's kind of interesting, at least to me, that in the 1990 NAHMS study, that was part of my thesis project, is we measured the non-sampling error in that study. But those typically are not measured in most probability studies. So the errors in measurement occur, okay, so we start with a construct, some idea that we're trying to measure on a farm, whether it's, application of certain biosecurity methods or whatnot, and then we try to develop a question that will perfectly measure that construct, which obviously doesn't happen. But we try our best to have questions that will measure that construct, and the difference between that is validity. So if we measure it fairly well, then we would say we have a valid measure of that construct. And then we go out and do the interviews and ask the questions, and that's leads to a response. The difference between what we record as a response and what the true answer is measurement error. And that's usually the largest impact on the quality of a study. And that's on you guys as the interviewer. So we want to look at some things that we can do to try to minimize measurement error. And then there's processing error, which is on us, and that's when we validate the data and whatnot. So that's the total survey error framework. That's really common perspective that a lot of survey researchers will use to try to keep in mind all the different places that where things can go wrong as far as generating estimates from our study. And what we can't measure, we just try to manage through training. So regarding the non-response error, it just shows, this is from a study actually where they kind of looked at two different people that were potential respondents. And the whole point of this, I don't want to go through the details, but there's various points of leverage to try to get people to respond. And whether it's the topic, whether it's the topic or the incentives or the burden. So for some people, the burden is not very important if the topic is something they're interested in. For other people, incentives are very important, and others not. So the point being, try to read your respondents and try to and realize that for some people, they'll really put a lot of weight on the fact that you work for USDA. Other people put a lot of weight on it's a goat study related to agritourism. So there's not one thing that will fit all respondents. You can have an introductory script. We don't do that. We haven't really got to the place where we provide introductory scripts. It probably would be good though for you to develop your own kind of introductory script, but that's kind of commonplace for a lot of survey research institutions. So going back to the total survey error framework, we want to focus on the measurement error ones, since that's the bulk of the interview respondent relationship. So we want to look at 5 things: interviewer behavior. We're trying to reduce measurement error in the study. So there's 5 things that we can do to make this a standardized data collection process, and that's where these interviews get a little uncomfortable, because you are warm-hearted kind of people that want to go out and have a conversation with the goat producer. And we're kind of cold, nerdy data people that want you to have a very standardized process of interacting with them. And so that's kind of a little disconnect there that you need to balance. So one is developing rapport with the respondent, and we'll look at some details with each of these. Read the questions exactly as worded, explain the process and procedures to the respondent, probe non-directively, and then record answers accurately. So as far as rapport with the respondent, so there's kind of a balance. Do you take a task-oriented approach, or do you have a personal approach? And the kind of the research out there is kind of non-conclusive on whether one is better than the other for the most part. So it's kind of striking a balance between those two. There is some good research, though, that does say when there's a discrepancy or difference, at least, between certain characteristics of the interviewer and the respondent, that can impact that relationship, specifically if there's a difference in education. So since you all are veterinarians and are most likely more educated than the producer, the respondent, it helps to start on a more personal basis to kind of cut the ice and to warm things up a little bit. But after that, to try to remain task-oriented. So the goal, too, is really to establish the right kind of relationship that you need for them to feel free to produce the right answers. So if you're too personal, then they can become too people-pleasing and want to tell you what you want to hear, which we don't want to have. So go for a balance of warm and professional. Refrain from expressing any views or opinions on topics that are covered in the questionnaire. So maybe you have goats yourself, you may not want to describe how you raise them. Refrain from presenting any personal information that might provide a basis for them inferring what your preferences may be. Again, we don't want to bias them. And also, some informal chatting on neutral topics is good, but for the most part, we want to remain task-oriented to keep it standardized and objective. There's not much to say about this one. Read questions exactly as worded. I mean, that's probably the strongest evidence in survey methodology research that is most consistent is on this point. That was the whole purpose of the opening dialogue between the Dominican and Jesuit priests, is that small changes in wording can have big impact. Explain the question and answer process to the respondent. So you're there as the interviewer is there as a guide to some degree to help the respondent work through the questions and answer them. So part of that is just describing the survey in general as we try to sell the program and get them to commit, but also for how to answer some of the questions. So we try our best, as Natalie said, to try to write questions that are clear and concise and have specific instructions for what we're asking for, but that we don't always achieve that, and so they may flounder and be confused, and so that's where you want to explain what you're asking for. So, for example, overall, how would you rate the school your child attends? Excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor? And the respondent may say, well, I'd say not so good. Well, that's not one of the options, so that's not what we're asking for. So as an interviewer, you need to explain to them, okay, what's being asked here is, was it excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor? And so you can go on, and this is probably maybe a little over the top, but and I'm not going to read it all, but essentially it's the interviewer explaining why it's important to answer according, based on the response categories that we provided, because we wanted to.
Without having sort of multiple choice to choose from, like excellent, very good, etc., doesn't that create the measurement? I don't remember the wording. The measurement error, because the person asking the question can interpret what the question means and maybe say something a little bit off, as opposed to reading the question exactly. So does that start building a little bit?
Well, yeah, and that's why, and this kind of ties into probing a little bit, and really probing's, ideally shouldn't happen. That's just because, we didn't write the questions as well as we should have. And there's only, so much time you can spend on writing questions. But yeah, and that's one of the things that's probably the hardest skill to develop as an interview is how to clarify and guide them without biasing them. But I think this, I like how they kind of take this. I mean, they're just telling them why we need to stick to the response categories provided, and then they just reread it and stuff like that. Going back, we'll look at probing. So again, probe really is just if the the respondent is confused or stuck, it's just words that the interviewer uses to try to get them unstuck, basically. So if they don't provide an adequate answer, or if it's not a complete answer, or it conflicts with the previous answer, then that's a good time as an interviewer to probe and clarify or ask for clarification. So you want to, again, the key principle here is to probe or to discuss with the respondent using words that will not affect their which response they give. So that's what we mean by non-directive probing. So for closed-ended questions, usually it's just best to repeat the question and the response category. So just read it again. For open-ended questions, like numeric questions, how many goats do you have or how many died, try to find the right format. So they may answer in a different format than what we're asking for. So here's some examples. I don't know if you can read that. No, I can't. So during the previous 12 months, how many of your goats had abscesses, boils, or lumps? We're looking for a number, and we say, yes, I had a few goats with lumps. Well, that's not the format that we want the response to be in. So that's an appropriate time to probe and say, well, how many would you say that was? You don't want to suggest numbers. If they said a few, it's like, oh, does that mean 3? You want to just, ask them to clarify. Yeah.
In the past when I've done this, I've often provided the interviewee with a copy so they can read along. Do you think that's good, or do you think it's best if they just listen and answer the question?
Can we get to that in the next? I think that's the next one. But that's a great question. So here's another question. How frequently were those vaccinated for Clostridium CP? 3 to 4 times a year, twice a year, annually, less often? They may say about 7 months. So again, that's a point where you need to probe. You don't want to guess for them or infer an answer from what they have said, but repeat the question for them. So 5 record answers exactly as given. So try to, if they have a narrative response, we try not to have too many narrative type questions, but if they do, try not to paraphrase and summarize. And write the response verbatim. Am I doing all right, Natalie, in time? All right. I just got a couple more slides, but so I wanted to look too at there's cognitive models for how the response processes occur. So I thought this was kind of interesting, but you may not. But anyway, so it starts with question comprehension. So we read the question to the respondent, and then we're waiting for the answer. So there's several steps that go on. First, they have to comprehend what was asked of them. Then they have to be able to retrieve the information that's being asked, and then they have to make some judgment or estimation on how they want to respond, and then they have to report that response. And so that's kind of a model for that process. And so based on that, there's several problems that can occur, things we want to be aware of. And one of these, to get to your question, Lynn. So one is failure to encode the information sought. So for example, and I remember this as a kid, there was some, I forget what it was, but somebody got robbed in one of our neighbors got robbed, and me and some of my friends that were playing outside saw the person. And so I remember the police asking us, well, describe what you saw. And it's like, we all describe things very differently. And, or even we've been looking at homes with my wife, and she'll say, oh yeah, I remember that house with the brown wall. So I don't remember a house with brown. I remember a house that was dark. I don't remember a brown wall. But we encode things differently. And another example is the dietary survey versus keeping a food diary. And they don't coincide at all, because people encode things, or remember things differently. So that's one problem that we can experience. Whoa, somehow I jumped to all of them. So another one is misinterpretation of the questions. So even common terms like children or weekday, weekend, you would think people would have similar ideas on, but they don't. Is the weekend start on Friday or Saturday? Are children people of a certain age, irregardless of relationship, or are they people of your relationship, irregardless of age? And so the third one is forgetting and other memory problems. I guess as far as a suggestion as an interviewer, if you go slow through the questionnaire, read things slowly, try to keep it at a slower tempo, that will aid recall. Flawed judgment or estimation strategy. So there's several different strategies. Of course, the idea is if they have an exact answer from records, they can just report that exact answer. Other techniques are more like bottom up. They're going to like, okay, I'll count. We had this many. Okay, here's the total, and so they'll count up. Others will instead of counting, will just use a rate base. So how often have you seen a doctor in the last 6 months? It's like, well, I go once a month, so I'll say 6. And so they'll use some rate base, and then other people will just take a wild guess. And if you can kind of clue into that, then you know again whether you want to probe. So, well, are you sure about so anyway, just to be aware of those different things. And so here's I'll get to your question, Lynn. So problems in formatting the answer. So it's kind of interesting. There's different effects that can occur when you ask a respondent a question and have multiple response categories. So if it's visual based, a lot of times they'll go with the first response category that's relatively close to the truth. And so if you give them a copy of the questionnaire and they're reading the questionnaire, it's basically almost a self-administered questionnaire, and it's a visual experience for them. So that would lead a lot of times to the effect of them choosing the first one. Whereas there's a recency effect if it's totally auditory, and if they're listening to a series of responses being read, they'll most often pick the most recent one that was read, which would be the last response category that fits. And so, if half of you are just doing the interview by reading the questionnaire and the other half are giving the questionnaire, we're going to have two different biases or effects that are working here. Eventually, when we go to electronic data collection, we'll be able to randomize. So that's how most studies are done now. They just randomize these response categories. But I think it's generally not a good thing. But we're not prescriptive on that. I know we ask a lot of very technical questions and can have long lists like for vaccines or whatnot. So it probably, we've tried to move those towards having a tear-off sheet that you can give to them. But yeah, does that answer your question? Not really. Generally, I think it's not a good idea, and ideally, we want to all do the same kind of, have the same mode, if you will.
You're not going to tell us.
No, I mean, unless Natalie or any of them want.
Tell them to give a questionnaire to the producer to follow along with. So
Yeah.
I think it's easier. A lot of the questions are technical, and so I think it's nice for them to be able to read it as well. So we'll go over that here in a few minutes. But.
So that's problems in formatting an answer, more or less deliberate misreporting. So, you can be, some questions are kind of intrusive. So like I could say, Amy, how many edibles did you bought while you're in Colorado? So most likely she's gonna say 0. And we know that's a good example of misreporting intentionally because it's an intrusive question. So there may be if you have a veterinary degree or public health background and you're asking questions about their biosecurity or their protection against visitors, there could be some deliberate misreporting because they're embarrassed by telling you the truth. So again, just be cognizant of that. And then failure to follow instructions. Again, this is just navigational errors. We try our best in the questionnaire to avoid that, but we'll never achieve perfection with that. So I think that's all I had. So that's just some tips, issues that you may experience as interviewers. Any questions or discussions? Cool. Thanks.